The auctioneer's voice cut through the dusty hall like a blade. $40 for the girl. Going once? Eleanor Whitfield stood on the platform, her hands trembling as strange faces assessed her worth like livestock. At 19, she had become cargo, traded by the aunt who raised her, sold to settle debts she never owed. Going twice. The Wyoming wind howled outside, carrying snow and the promise of a frontier that broke the weak. When the gavel fell, she belonged to a stranger. A widowed rancher, 5 fatherless children, and a ranch where winter never seemed to end. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. And if this opening caught you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't believe where this journey leads. The wagon rattled over frozen ground, each jolt sending pain through Eleanor's spine as she clutched her single carpet bag against her chest. The fabric was worn thin at the corners, much like everything else she owned. Inside, 2 dresses, a hairbrush missing half its bristles, a photograph of parents she barely remembered, and the shame of knowing she'd been worth exactly $40 to the only family she had left. Not much farther now, the driver said, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his weathered face. He was a local man, paid to transport her from the town depot to the Hayes Ranch. He hadn't spoken much during the 2-hour journey, and Eleanor was grateful for the silence. Words felt dangerous now, capable of cracking the fragile shell she'd built around herself since the auction 3 days prior. The Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly in every direction. White fields broken only by dark clusters of pine and the occasional skeletal cottonwood. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the threat of more snow. Eleanor had never seen such emptiness. Back in Kansas City, buildings pressed against one another, and people filled every street. Here, the world seemed designed to swallow a person whole. That's it, the driver said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings emerging from the white expanse. The Hayes Ranch materialized like something from a fever dream. The main house was larger than Eleanor expected, 2 stories of weathered timber with a wraparound porch that had seen better days. Several outbuildings dotted the property, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a smokehouse, what looked like a bunkhouse, and various sheds in varying states of disrepair. Smoke rose from the main house's chimney, the only sign of life in the frozen tableau. As they approached, Eleanor noticed details that spoke of neglect. Shutters hung askew on several windows. The porch steps needed repair. A wagon wheel leaned against the barn, clearly abandoned mid-fix. This was not a thriving operation. This was a place barely holding itself together. The driver pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch. Before Eleanor could gather her courage to step down, the front door opened. Daniel Hayes emerged into the cold. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his canvas coat. His dark hair needed cutting, falling past his collar in waves that suggested he rarely thought about such things. A beard covered the lower half of his face, but couldn't hide the hard line of his jaw or the deep-set eyes that assessed her with the same cool evaluation she'd seen at the auction. He looked to be in his mid-30s, though the lines around his eyes suggested a man who'd aged beyond his years. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried easily across the snow. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Eleanor forced herself to stand, though her legs had gone numb from the cold and the fear that lived in her bones now. She climbed down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could summon, her worn boots sinking into snow that rose past her ankles. Daniel Hayes didn't offer to help her down. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. The driver unloaded her carpet bag and accepted payment from Daniel without ceremony. Within moments, the wagon was pulling away, and Eleanor stood alone before the man who had purchased her labor for the next year. The contract her aunt had signed was clear: room, board, and $10 a month in exchange for household work and childcare. 1 year. Then Eleanor would be free to go wherever she wished, if she survived that long. "You're younger than I expected," Daniel said, his eyes moving over her face with clinical detachment. "Whitaker said you could cook and clean." "Yes, sir." Eleanor hated how small her voice sounded. She straightened her spine, forcing strength into her words. "I can do both. I can also sew, mend, garden, preserve food, and manage a household budget." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or assessment. "We'll see. You understand the arrangement?" Room and board in exchange for housework and helping with the children. $10 monthly wage. 1-year contract. The children are not to be disciplined without my permission, Daniel continued, his voice hardening. You're here to cook, clean, and assist with daily care. Nothing more. You are not their mother. You will never be their mother. Are we clear? The words hit like physical blows, but Eleanor kept her expression neutral. Perfectly clear, Mr. Hayes. Then come inside before you freeze. He turned and walked toward the house without waiting to see if she followed. Eleanor grabbed her carpet bag and hurried after him, her numb feet stumbling in the deep snow. The porch steps creaked under her weight, definitely in need of repair. She followed Daniel through the front door and into a world of barely contained chaos. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, dominated by a large fireplace that struggled to heat the cavernous space. A long wooden table occupied the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Dirty dishes covered every surface. Children's belongings littered the floor, a wooden horse missing one leg, a rag doll with yarn hair, scattered books, a muddy pair of small boots. Laundry hung from lines strung across the room in a desperate attempt to dry in the winter humidity. The air smelled of wood smoke, unwashed dishes, and the particular staleness that came from too many people living in too small a space for too long. 4 children sat around the table, staring at Eleanor with varying expressions of curiosity and suspicion. A 5th child, a baby, slept in a cradle near the fire. Children, Daniel said, his voice cutting through the silence. This is Miss Whitfield. She'll be helping around the house. You will show her respect and obey her instructions regarding household matters. The children continued to stare. Daniel pointed to each in turn. Rebecca. She's 12. The oldest girl sat at the head of the table, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older than her years. Her eyes were the same deep brown as her father's, and they held similar hardness. Thomas. He's 10. A boy with lighter hair and a face full of freckles. He looked away when Eleanor met his eyes. Sarah, she's 8. A girl with wild curls and a stubborn set to her jaw. Caleb, he's 6. The youngest boy, thin as a rail with enormous eyes that seemed to take up half his face. And that's Mary in the cradle. She'll be 1 year old next month. Hello? Eleanor said softly, trying to smile. I'm pleased to meet you all. Silence. Rebecca stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. I've made stew for dinner. It's on the stove. Her voice was flat, controlled. I assume you'll want to settle in before taking over kitchen duties. Rebecca. Daniel's voice held warning. It's all right, Eleanor said quickly. She recognized the protective stance, the barely concealed hostility. This girl had been holding her family together. Having a stranger arrive to take over her role must feel like losing control of the only thing she had left. I appreciate you keeping things running. I'm sure the stew is wonderful. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly, searching for mockery and finding none. Without responding, she walked to the stove and began ladling stew into bowls with practiced efficiency. Your room is upstairs, Daniel said to Eleanor. First door on the right. It's small, but it has a bed and a stove. You'll share the washroom with the children. Dinner is at 6. Breakfast at dawn. I expect the children ready for their lessons by 8. Lessons? Rebecca teaches the younger ones. Reading, writing, arithmetic. She uses their mother's books. Something dark crossed his face at the mention of his late wife. Don't interfere with that. I wouldn't dream of it, Mr. Hayes. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was sincere or simply saying what he wanted to hear. Finally, he nodded. Go settle in. Rebecca will call you when dinner's ready. Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs with her carpet bag, acutely aware of the children's eyes following her progress. The second floor was even colder than the first. She found her room easily, a small space barely large enough for the narrow bed, a small dresser, and a potbelly stove that currently held no fire. A single window looked out over the snow-covered fields toward distant mountains. The room was bare of any personal touches, but it was clean. Someone, probably Rebecca, had made the bed with military precision. Eleanor set down her bag and sat on the edge of the mattress, her hands shaking now that she was alone. The reality of her situation crashed over her in waves. She was in the middle of Wyoming, miles from the nearest town, living with a family of strangers who neither wanted nor trusted her. She had no money beyond what she would earn here, no family who cared whether she lived or died, and no prospects beyond this one-year contract. For the first time since the auction, Eleanor allowed herself to cry, but only for 5 minutes. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her dress, and went downstairs to meet her new life. Itik. Dinner was a tense affair. Rebecca served the stew with the same efficiency she'd shown before, placing bowls in front of each person without comment. The food was actually quite good, thick with vegetables and chunks of venison, seasoned with herbs that spoke of someone who knew their way around a kitchen. Eleanor said so, and Rebecca's only response was a slight tightening around her eyes. Daniel ate in silence, his attention focused on his food. Thomas picked at his stew, pushing pieces around his bowl without actually eating much. Sarah ate with single-minded determination, as if worried someone might take her food away. Caleb watched Eleanor with those enormous eyes, occasionally glancing at his father as if checking whether it was safe to look at the stranger. The baby woke halfway through the meal, her cries sharp and demanding. Rebecca started to rise, but Daniel waved her back to her seat. He lifted Mary from the cradle with practiced ease, settling her against his shoulder and rubbing her back until the crying softened to whimpers. Eleanor watched this with interest. Whatever else Daniel Hayes might be, he was not a distant father. "Miss Whitfield," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. "How long have you worked as a housekeeper?" The question was a test. Eleanor could hear it in the girl's tone. "I haven't," Eleanor said honestly. "I helped my aunt manage her boarding house for 6 years, but I wasn't employed as staff. I simply lived there and contributed to the household." "So you have no actual experience?" "I have practical experience. I've cooked for 30 boarders at a time, managed household accounts, organized cleaning schedules, and dealt with everything from broken pipes to bed bugs to tenants who couldn't pay rent." Rebecca's expression remained skeptical. "This isn't a boarding house." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It's harder. A boarding house serves strangers who pay for services. A home requires actual care." Something shifted in Rebecca's face, not softening, exactly, but a slight easing of the hardness, as if Eleanor had said something that aligned with the girl's own beliefs. "Why did your aunt send you away?" Thomas asked suddenly. His voice was softer than Eleanor expected, almost shy. "Thomas," Daniel said sharply, "that's inappropriate." "It's all right," Eleanor said, though her chest tightened. "My aunt's boarding house fell on hard times. She needed to sell it and move in with her sister. There wasn't room for me." It was a sanitized version of the truth. The real story involved debts, accusations of theft that Eleanor hadn't committed, and an aunt who'd decided an orphan niece was a convenient scapegoat. But these children didn't need to hear about betrayal and injustice. They'd had enough of that in their young lives. "So she got rid of you," Sarah said, her tone matter-of-fact. The bluntness stole Eleanor's breath, but before she could respond, Daniel spoke. "Sarah, that's enough." "But it's true, isn't it?" Sarah looked at Eleanor with eyes too old for an 8-year-old face. "Nobody wants extra people. They only keep you if you're useful." The silence that followed was suffocating. Eleanor set down her spoon carefully. "You're right," she said quietly. "My aunt kept me as long as I was useful. When I became a burden, she found a way to remove me from her life." She met Sarah's eyes directly. "But that doesn't mean I'm not worth keeping. It means she didn't know how to see value in people beyond what they could do for her." Sarah stared at her, clearly not expecting such honesty. "Everyone at this table has value," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to choke her. "Whether they're useful or not, whether they're wanted or not. Your worth isn't determined by other people's inability to see it." Rebecca stood abruptly, gathering empty bowls with sharp movements. "I'll clean up," she said, her voice tight. "You should rest, Miss Whitfield. You've had a long journey." It was a dismissal, but not a cruel one. Eleanor stood as well. "I'll help." "No need." "I insist." For a moment, Rebecca looked as if she might argue. Then she shrugged and carried the bowls to the wash basin. Eleanor followed with more dishes, and they worked in silence while Daniel put Mary back in her cradle and sent the other children upstairs to prepare for bed. The kitchen was a disaster. Dishes were piled everywhere, the counters were sticky with spilled food, and the floor needed sweeping. Eleanor assessed it all with a practiced eye. already making mental lists of what needed immediate attention and what could wait. "The pump's outside, but," Rebecca said, not looking at Eleanor. "Water has to be heated on the stove for washing. We're low on soap. There's a bit left in the cupboard, but I haven't had time to make more." "I can make soap," Eleanor said. "Do you have lye and tallow?" Rebecca's hand stilled in the wash water. "Some. In the cellar." "Then I'll make soap tomorrow." They washed dishes in silence for several minutes. Eleanor could feel the weight of Rebecca's unspoken thoughts, the questions and judgments hovering in the air between them. "My mother died a year ago last October," Rebecca said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Fever took her in 3 days. One morning, she was fine. By week's end, she was gone." Eleanor's hands stilled. "I'm sorry. Father hired 2 women before you. The first one lasted 2 weeks before she ran off with a traveling merchant. The second one made it 3 months before she decided ranch life wasn't for her and moved to town." Rebecca scrubbed a pot with vicious intensity. "You won't last either. Women always leave." The pain in those words was almost unbearable. "I signed a contract," Eleanor said softly. 1 year. I don't break my promises." "Promises don't mean much when keeping them gets hard." Eleanor couldn't argue with that. She'd learned the same lesson. "You're right," she said instead. "Promises are easy to make and hard to keep. All I can tell you is that I'll be here tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and every morning until my contract is fulfilled." Rebecca said nothing, but something in her posture softened, just slightly. They finished the dishes in silence. By the time they were done, Daniel had returned downstairs and was adding wood to the fire. He looked up as they finished, his eyes moving between his daughter and the newcomer as if trying to gauge what had passed between them. "Rebecca, bed," he said simply. Rebecca dried her hands and headed for the stairs without argument, but she paused halfway up and looked back at Eleanor. "There's extra blankets in the chest in your room. It gets cold at night. The stove burns through wood fast, so don't load it too full before bed." It was, Eleanor realized, an act of kindness. "Thank you," she said. Rebecca nodded and disappeared upstairs. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, suddenly aware that she was alone with Daniel Hayes for the first time since her arrival. He remained by the fire, one arm resting on the mantel, watching the flames with an expression of deep weariness. "She's protective," he said without looking at Eleanor. "They all are, in their own ways. They've lost enough. They don't need to lose anything else." "I understand." "Do you?" He turned to face her then, and the firelight caught the planes of his face, highlighting the exhaustion carved into every line. "You're here because I needed help. Nothing more. Don't mistake that for something it isn't." The words were cruel in their honesty, but Eleanor appreciated them more than false kindness. "I won't," she said quietly. "I know exactly why I'm here, Mr. Hayes. You needed a housekeeper. I needed a roof over my head. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, that she wasn't offended by his bluntness. He studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "The children wake early," he said finally. "Rebecca usually handles breakfast, but that's your responsibility now. Oatmeal or eggs, sometimes both if we have enough. Lunch is typically leftovers or bread and cheese. Dinner needs to be substantial. We work hard here. Questions? Where do you take your meals?" "With the family, always." His tone brooked no argument on this point. "We eat together. It's one of the few rules their mother insisted on, and I won't break it." Their mother, not my wife. The distinction was telling. "Understood," Eleanor said. "Anything else I should know?" "Don't go into the barn alone. The animals aren't used to strangers. Don't wander off the property. Weather can turn fast out here, and people freeze to death in storms. Don't touch anything in the study upstairs. And don't—" He stopped, his jaw working as if the next words were difficult. "Don't try to replace her. The children don't need a new mother. They need help. That's all." Each prohibition felt like a wall going up between them, clearly marking the boundaries of Eleanor's place in this household. "I understand," she said again, because what else could she say? Daniel nodded and turned back to the fire. Eleanor recognized a dismissal when she saw one. She made her way upstairs, her body aching with exhaustion and her mind spinning with everything she'd learned in the past few hours. Her room was freezing. Eleanor found the blankets Rebecca had mentioned and used them to build a nest on the narrow bed. She changed into her nightgown, her fingers clumsy with cold, and climbed under the covers fully dressed. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the house settling for the night. Floorboards creaking, someone coughing, the wind rattling the windows. And beneath it all, a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. This house was full of people, but it felt utterly empty. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't quiet. She thought about Rebecca's fierce protectiveness, Thomas's shy glances, Sarah's brutal honesty, Caleb's watchful silence. She thought about Daniel Hayes and the way he held his baby daughter with such careful tenderness while keeping everyone else at arm's length. And she thought about herself. Eleanor Whitfield, the girl worth $40, now responsible for holding together a family that didn't want her. Somewhere in the house, a child cried out in their sleep. Eleanor heard footsteps, Daniel's heavy tread, and then soft murmuring as he soothed whatever nightmare had taken hold. The tenderness in his voice carried through the walls, and Eleanor felt something crack in her chest. These people had loved so deeply and lost so completely that they'd built walls to keep themselves safe. And Eleanor, who had her own walls, her own scars from betrayal and loss, would have to find a way to live among them without breaking either their defenses or her own. She pulled the blankets tighter and stared at the ceiling, watching shadows dance in the darkness. 1 year, she reminded herself. 1 year, and then she'd be free, if she could survive that long. Ishamt. The next morning arrived brutally early. Eleanor woke to darkness and cold, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory returned. Wyoming. The Hayes Ranch. Her new life. She forced herself from the warmth of the blankets and dressed quickly, layering every piece of clothing she owned against the cold. Her fingers fumbled with buttons and laces, numb despite her haste. She needed to get the fire going, needed to start breakfast before the family woke. But when she made her way downstairs, lamp in hand, she found Rebecca already in the kitchen. The girl stood at the stove, efficiently stoking the fire and setting a pot of water to boil. She looked up as Eleanor entered, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "You're up early," Rebecca said. "So are you. Someone has to start the day." Rebecca turned back to the stove, adding wood with practiced precision. "Coffee's nearly ready. Father takes his black. The children get milk if we have it, water if we don't." Eleanor moved to the counter, looking for something to do. "What can I help with?" "The eggs need collecting, coops behind the house. Watch for the rooster, he's mean." It was clearly a test. Rebecca wanted to see if the city girl would balk at real ranch work. Eleanor found a coat hanging by the door, too large, probably Daniel's spare, and wrapped it around herself before heading out into the pre-dawn darkness. The cold hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. She fumbled with the lamp, using its weak light to navigate to the chicken coop. The building was small but sturdy, and inside it was marginally warmer than outside. The chickens made soft, disgruntled noises as Eleanor disturbed them, carefully reaching under warm bodies to retrieve eggs. The rooster, true to Rebecca's warning, made several threatening advances, but Eleanor had dealt with ornery roosters before. She moved calmly, keeping the basket between them, and collected a dozen eggs without incident. By the time she returned to the house, her fingers were so numb she could barely hold the basket. Rebecca took it from her without comment, already moving to start the eggs while Eleanor thawed her hands by the stove. They worked in silence, falling into an unspoken rhythm. Rebecca started the eggs while Eleanor mixed oatmeal, both moving around the kitchen with careful awareness of the other's space. It wasn't companionship, but it wasn't hostility either. The children began appearing as dawn broke. Thomas first, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Then Sarah, her curls wild from the pillow. Caleb came down clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, and finally Daniel descended with Mary on his hip. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from sleep. His eyes moved over the kitchen, taking in the prepared breakfast, the clean counters, the orderly table. Something crossed his face, approval perhaps, or simply relief that Eleanor seemed capable. They ate together, the meal punctuated by the sounds of spoons on bowls and Mary's babbling. Eleanor observed more than she ate, watching the way the family moved around each other. Rebecca helped Caleb with his oatmeal without being asked. Thomas cut his little sister's egg into tiny pieces. Sarah ate with fierce concentration, but periodically glanced at her father as if checking that he was still there. This was a family functioning in survival mode, each member doing what needed to be done to keep the whole together. There was love here, Eleanor realized, but it was love wrapped in grief and exhaustion, unable to fully express itself. "Rebecca," Daniel said as he finished his coffee. "Lessons at 8 as usual. Thomas, you're with me this morning. We need to check the fence lines in the north pasture. Sarah, you'll help Miss Whitfield with the household tasks." Sarah's head snapped up. "But no arguments." The girl's jaw set in a stubborn line, but she didn't protest further. Daniel rose, Mary still on his hip, and handed the baby to Eleanor. "She'll need changing and breakfast. Rebecca knows what she eats." Eleanor took Mary carefully, acutely aware that this was the first time she'd held the child. The baby was heavier than she looked, solid and warm. She stared at Eleanor with wide eyes that were the same deep brown as her father's and eldest sister's. "Hello, sweetheart," Eleanor said softly. Mary studied her for a long moment, then reached out and grabbed Eleanor's nose. Despite everything, Eleanor laughed. When she looked up, she caught Daniel watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. But it wasn't hostile, and that felt like progress. He left with Thomas shortly after, bundled against the cold, and Rebecca ushered Caleb upstairs for his lessons. That left Eleanor with Sarah and the baby, along with a kitchen full of dirty dishes and a house that desperately needed attention. "Right," Eleanor said, setting Mary in the cradle near the fire. "Sarah, would you show me where your mother kept the cleaning supplies?" Sarah's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why?" "Because I need to clean, and I'd rather not spend an hour searching for rags and soap." "You're going to clean?" The girl's tone suggested this was somehow suspicious. "That is why I'm here." Sarah studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Supplies are in the pantry, rags are in the basket by the door. Broom's in the corner." "Thank you." Eleanor found the supplies and assessed the kitchen with a critical eye. It would take hours to properly clean this space, and that was before she even considered the rest of the house. She started with the dishes, heating water and scrubbing each piece until it shone. Sarah watched from the table, pretending to read a book but clearly monitoring Eleanor's every move. "You can help if you'd like," Eleanor said without turning around. "I'm reading." "So you are." Eleanor continued washing. "What book?" "Robinson Crusoe." "That's a good one. Have you gotten to the part where he finds Friday yet?" Sarah's silence was telling. Eleanor smiled to herself, recognizing a child who'd been caught not actually reading. "I've read it 3 times, Eleanor continued conversationally. "The first time, I thought it was an adventure story. The second time, I thought it was about survival. The third time, I realized it was about loneliness and what happens to a person when they're completely alone." She heard Sarah's chair scrape against the floor, then small footsteps approaching. The girl appeared at her elbow, book in hand. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked despite herself. "Crusoe had everything he needed to survive," Eleanor said, rinsing a plate. "Food, shelter, safety. But he was desperately lonely. He talked to his parrot just to hear a voice, even if it was just his own words repeated back. When he found Friday, it wasn't just about having help. It was about having someone to share his life with." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, in a very small voice, "Sometimes I talk to Mama's things, her brushes and her sewing basket, just so it feels like she's still here." Eleanor's hands stilled in the wash water. She looked down at the girl beside her, this fierce, stubborn 8-year-old who was trying so hard to be strong. "I think your mama would like that," Eleanor said gently. "She'd want you to remember her." "Rebecca says we shouldn't talk about her because it makes Papa sad." "Sadness isn't always bad, Sarah. Sometimes sadness is just love with nowhere to go." The girl considered this, her small face serious. Then she set down her book and picked up a dish towel. "I'll dry," she said. They worked together in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. More peaceful, less hostile. By midday, the kitchen was cleaner than it had been in months. Eleanor moved through the rest of the house, Sarah trailing behind like a small shadow. The main floor consisted of the kitchen, a sitting room that looked rarely used, and Daniel's study, the door to which was firmly closed, per his instructions. Upstairs, besides Eleanor's small room, there were 4 bedrooms. The largest belonged to Daniel and still held evidence of his late wife. A hairbrush on the dresser, a shawl draped over a chair, small touches that no one had dared to remove. The children's rooms were chaotic, but not dirty, full of the particular clutter that came from young people living their lives. The last room was the nursery, where Mary slept. It was the only room that felt truly cared for, as if someone, probably Rebecca, had been maintaining it as a shrine to better times. Eleanor didn't touch any of the personal items. She simply swept, dusted, and tidied, returning things to their proper places without disturbing the essence of the space. By the time Daniel and Thomas returned for lunch, the house had been transformed. It wasn't perfect. That would take days, maybe weeks. But it was significantly better. Daniel paused in the doorway, taking in the clean kitchen with visible surprise. His eyes moved to Eleanor, who was serving stew she'd made from leftovers and vegetables she'd found in the cold cellar. "You've been busy," he said. "That's what you're paying me for, Mr. Hayes." Something almost like approval flickered across his face. He washed up and joined the family at the table, where Rebecca and Caleb had emerged from their lessons upstairs. The afternoon passed in a blur of work. Eleanor made soap using the lye and tallow from the cellar, following a recipe her aunt had taught her years ago. She mended a tear in one of Thomas's shirts. She made bread for tomorrow's meals. She changed Mary's diaper 3 times and learned that the baby liked to be sung to in a high, silly voice that made her laugh. By dinner time, Eleanor was exhausted. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from honest work and visible progress. That night, as the family gathered for the evening meal, Eleanor noticed small changes. Thomas talked more, telling his father about something he'd seen while checking the fence lines. Sarah sat closer to Eleanor at the table, occasionally stealing glances as if making sure she was still there. Even Caleb seemed slightly less wary, though he still watched Eleanor with those enormous, cautious eyes. Rebecca remained distant, but she'd stopped actively resisting Eleanor's presence. It was a start. After dinner, Eleanor helped Rebecca clean up, and they worked in the same companionable silence as before. When they finished, Rebecca lingered at the sink, her hands gripping the edge as if gathering courage for something. "You did well today," she said finally, not looking at Eleanor. "The house, it looks better." It was the closest thing to praise Eleanor had received since arriving. "Thank you," she said softly. "Your mother's organization system made it easier. Whoever set up this kitchen knew what they were doing." Rebecca's hands tightened on the sink. "That was Mama. She said a well-run kitchen was the heart of a happy home." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. Eleanor took a careful step closer. She was right. "I've tried to keep things the way she did, but I can't." Rebecca's shoulders began to shake. Without thinking, Eleanor reached out and placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. Rebecca flinched but didn't pull away. "You've been carrying this family for over a year," Eleanor said quietly. "You're 12 years old and you've been mother, teacher, and housekeeper to your siblings. You've been incredible, Rebecca. But you don't have to do it alone anymore." "I don't need help." But the words lacked conviction. "Maybe not. But maybe it's okay to accept it anyway." Rebecca turned then, and Eleanor saw tears streaming down her young face. "What if you leave? What if we get used to you being here and then you go away like everyone else?" There it was, the fear beneath the hostility. Eleanor knelt so she was at eye level with the girl. "I signed a contract for 1 year. 1 year from now, in late January, that contract will end. What happens after that, I don't know. But I promise you, Rebecca, I will be here every single day until then. You can count on that. Promises don't mean anything." "Then don't trust my promises. Trust my actions. Watch what I do, not what I say. And if I ever give you reason to doubt me, you have every right to call me on it." Rebecca stared at her, tears still falling. Then, in a movement so fast Eleanor almost missed it, the girl wrapped her arms around Eleanor's neck and held on tight. Eleanor held her back, this fierce, protective, terrified child who'd been trying to hold her world together with sheer willpower. She held her while Rebecca cried silently into her shoulder, releasing grief and fear she'd probably been holding in for months. When Rebecca finally pulled away, she wiped her face roughly and straightened her shoulders. "Don't tell Papa," she said. "I won't. Or the others. Never." Rebecca nodded and headed for the stairs, but halfway up she paused and looked back. Good night, Miss Whitfield. Good night, Rebecca. After the girl disappeared, Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen, her heart aching for these wounded children and their grieving father. She looked around the clean space, at the evidence of her day's work, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. She wasn't just surviving here, she was needed, and maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference. As Eleanor finally made her way to her cold little room that night, she paused on the landing and looked back at the house below. Through doors and walls, she could sense the family settling for the night. Daniel putting Mary to bed, the children in their rooms, the house creaking and breathing around them all. This broken, grieving, barely holding together family. And Eleanor, the girl worth $40, who'd somehow found herself in the middle of it all. She climbed into bed and pulled the blankets tight, listening to the wind howl across the frozen prairie. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more walls to navigate, more grief to witness, more trust to earn. But for the first time since the auction, Eleanor went to sleep without crying. She went to sleep wondering if maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found something worth staying for. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural, though Eleanor knew better than to mistake routine for acceptance. Each morning began in darkness with Rebecca already at the stove, the two of them moving through breakfast preparation with an efficiency born of repetition rather than friendship. Each evening ended with dishes and quiet conversations that never quite crossed into genuine warmth. Progress, Eleanor had learned, came in inches on this frozen ranch, not miles. But there were small victories. Thomas had begun leaving his books on the kitchen table instead of hiding them in his room, a silent invitation for Eleanor to see what he was reading. Sarah now helped with chores without being asked, though she still maintained her fierce independence like armor. Caleb had spoken directly to Eleanor twice, once to ask for more eggs at breakfast, and once to show her a rock he'd found that looked like a horse's head. Each interaction felt like a gift, carefully offered and cautiously received. Mary, at least, had no reservations. The baby had taken to Eleanor with the easy affection of the very young, reaching for her in the mornings and protesting when anyone else tried to put her down for naps. Daniel had noticed, his eyes tracking the way his daughter nestled into Eleanor's arms, but he said nothing about it. Rebecca remained the most complicated. Some days she was almost friendly, working alongside Eleanor with something approaching companionship. Other days she retreated behind walls of silence, watching Eleanor with an expression that suggested she was waiting for inevitable disappointment. Eleanor understood. Trust, once broken, didn't rebuild itself overnight. It was during the third week, while Eleanor was beating rugs in the yard and trying to ignore the bitter wind that cut through her borrowed coat, that she found the first note. It had fallen from between the pages of a cookbook Eleanor had pulled from the shelf, a small piece of paper covered in elegant handwriting. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. Rebecca loves honey in her tea when she's sad. She won't ask for it, but it helps. Eleanor stood in the cold yard, the rug beater forgotten in her hand, staring at those words. This was the first wife's handwriting. Catherine Hayes, the woman whose absence filled every corner of this house like smoke. She went back inside and searched more carefully. In the linen closet, tucked behind a stack of towels. Thomas needs extra time with reading. Be patient. He's bright, but the letters confuse him. In the pantry, wedged between jars of preserves, Sarah's temper comes from fear. When she's angry, she's really scared. Behind the children's books in the sitting room, Caleb speaks with his hands more than words. Watch his fingers. They'll tell you what he needs. There were more, dozens of them, scattered throughout the house like breadcrumbs left by a woman who'd known she was dying and wanted to help whoever came after. Each note was a small piece of guidance, a mother's knowledge passed on to a stranger. Eleanor gathered them carefully, her hands shaking. This was what Catherine Hayes had left behind, not just a house and 5 children, but instructions on how to love them properly. That evening, after the children were in bed, Eleanor found Daniel in his study. The door was open for once, and he sat at his desk surrounded by ledgers and papers, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked up when she knocked, and something wary entered his expression. "Miss Whitfield, do you need something?" She held out the notes she'd collected. "I found these. Throughout the house. I thought you should know." Daniel stood and crossed to her, taking the papers with careful hands. His eyes scanned the words, and Eleanor watched his face transform. Pain, love, grief, all chasing across his features like clouds across the sun. His fingers trembled slightly as he shuffled through them. "I didn't know she'd done this," he said finally, his voice rough. "She never told me. She was thinking of them, making sure whoever came after would know how to care for them properly." Daniel looked up at her, and for the first time since Eleanor had arrived, she saw past his defenses to the devastation beneath. "She knew," he said. "The fever came on fast, but there was a day, maybe two, when she knew she wasn't going to make it. I thought she was resting. She must have been writing these instead." The grief in his voice was so raw that Eleanor had to look away. "I shouldn't have brought them to you," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I just thought—" "No." He cut her off, his voice firmer. "You were right to show me." He shuffled through the notes again, reading each one as if memorizing the words. Then he handed them back to her. "Keep them. Use them. That's what Catherine would have wanted. Mr. Hayes, she loved them more than anything in this world," Daniel continued, speaking more to himself than to Eleanor. "She loved them so much she tried to make sure they'd be cared for even after she was gone. That's who she was, always thinking of others first." Eleanor held the notes carefully, feeling the weight of responsibility they represented. "I'll do my best to honor her wishes." Daniel studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face for something. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" "Someone harder, more desperate. Women don't usually come this far from civilization unless they're running from something or have nowhere else to go." "I have nowhere else to go," Eleanor said honestly. That part was true. "But you're not desperate." "I'm practical. There's a difference." Something almost like a smile touched his mouth, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Catherine would have liked you. She always said the world needed more practical women and fewer romantic ones." It was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name in Eleanor's presence, and the intimacy of it felt both precious and dangerous. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said softly. "About her. The children rarely speak of her, and I've been afraid to ask. They think talking about her hurts me." Daniel returned to his desk and sat heavily, suddenly looking every one of his years and more. "They're probably right, but not talking about her doesn't make the pain go away. It just makes her absence louder." Eleanor understood that better than he knew. She'd learned the same lesson when her parents died, leaving her with an aunt who preferred silence to grief. "If you ever want to talk about her," Eleanor offered, "I'm willing to listen." Daniel looked at her with surprise, as if no one had made such an offer before. "Why would you want to hear about another woman?" "Because she's important to this family, and because understanding her helps me understand them." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Thank you, Miss Whitfield. That's kind of you." Eleanor left him to his ledgers and his grief, but she carried the notes upstairs and read each one by lamplight before bed. Catherine Hayes spoke through her words. A woman who'd been organized, loving, observant, and deeply committed to her children's well-being. She'd noticed small details that others might miss. She'd understood that each child needed different things. She'd loved them enough to leave guidance for a stranger. Eleanor fell asleep that night, wondering what it must have been like to love so completely and lose so much. The answer came in pieces over the following days. She watched Daniel with his children and saw a man trying desperately to be both father and mother, always falling short in his own estimation. She saw Rebecca carrying responsibility that would have crushed most adults. She saw Thomas struggling with reading lessons he was too ashamed to admit confused him. She saw Sarah's anger masking terror that everyone she loved would disappear. She saw Caleb going quiet when emotions overwhelmed him, his small hands fluttering in gestures only he understood. And she began, slowly and carefully, to use Catherine's notes. She started making tea with honey for Rebecca on difficult days, saying nothing about it, just setting the cup beside the girl while she worked on lessons. Rebecca's eyes would widen slightly, and something would ease in her shoulders, but she never asked how Eleanor knew. She spent extra time with Thomas during evening hours, helping him sound out words without judgment when the letters swam before his eyes. "My father had the same trouble," she told him one night, which was true. "He said the letters liked to dance when they should stand still. But he learned to make them behave, and so will you. Thomas had looked at her with desperate hope. Really? He got better? He became a carpenter, had to read plans and measurements every day. The letters never stopped dancing entirely, but he learned to dance with them. When Sarah's temper flared, usually over something small that triggered larger fears, Eleanor didn't punish or scold. Instead, she sat nearby and waited, giving the girl space to feel what she needed to feel. Sometimes Sarah would eventually curl up next to her, not speaking, just needing presence. Eleanor provided it without demands. And Caleb, sweet, silent Caleb with his careful hands and enormous eyes. Eleanor learned to watch his fingers, to understand that when they tapped his leg in certain patterns, he needed quiet. When they fluttered near his face, he was overwhelmed. When they reached out slowly, palm up, he wanted connection but didn't have words for it. One afternoon, she found him in the barn, sitting in the hay and moving his hands in elaborate patterns. She sat down nearby, not speaking, just watching. After a while, Caleb looked at her and signed something. She had no idea what, but his hands were asking a question. "I don't understand," Eleanor said gently, "but I want to." Caleb studied her, then pointed to himself and moved his hands in a specific pattern. "That's your name?" Eleanor guessed. He nodded. "Can you teach me?" What followed was half an hour of Caleb patiently showing Eleanor simple signs. His name, his siblings' names, hungry, tired, happy, sad. He was more animated than she'd ever seen him, his whole face lighting up when she managed to copy his gestures correctly. "This is wonderful, Caleb," she said, signing happy the way he'd shown her. "Thank you for teaching me." He beamed at her, and Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. That evening, she asked Daniel about it. "Does Caleb know sign language? Real sign language, I mean." Daniel looked up from the fence post he was repairing, surprise crossing his face. "Some. Catherine learned it from a book when she realized he wasn't talking much. She taught him basics, enough to communicate. Why?" "He's been teaching me. I wondered if I should find proper resources to learn more." Daniel set down his tools and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You'd do that? Learn a whole language for one child?" "Why wouldn't I? The other women who worked here, they thought his silence was stubbornness. They tried to force him to speak." Eleanor felt anger kindle in her chest. "Speaking isn't the only way to communicate." "No," Daniel said quietly. "It isn't. Catherine used to say the same thing." He picked up his tools again, but there was less tension in his shoulders. "There's a book in the study, bottom shelf, left side. It's the one she used. You're welcome to it." That night, Eleanor found the book, a worn manual on American Sign Language with notes in the margins in Catherine's elegant handwriting. Eleanor brought it to her room and studied by lamplight until her eyes burned and her fingers ached from practicing shapes. Over the following week, she learned more signs. Simple ones at first: eat, sleep, water, help, thank you. Caleb was delighted to have someone who could understand him, and he began signing constantly, teaching Eleanor new words whenever they worked together. The other children noticed. "Why are you learning that?" Sarah asked one morning, watching Eleanor and Caleb sign back and forth about whether he wanted eggs or oatmeal for breakfast. "Because Caleb has things to say and I want to hear them." "But he can talk if he wants to. Papa says so." "Maybe," Eleanor said carefully, "but wanting to and being able to aren't always the same thing. Would you want to talk if it felt like pushing boulders uphill every time you opened your mouth?" Sarah considered this, her sharp mind working through the implications. "I guess not." Caleb's not being stubborn or difficult. He's just communicating in a way that's easier for him. There's nothing wrong with that. That afternoon, Eleanor found Sarah sitting with Caleb, trying to learn signs herself. The girl's fingers were clumsy at first, but Caleb patiently corrected her, and Sarah, prickly, defensive Sarah, accepted instruction from her little brother with unexpected grace. Rebecca, too, began asking questions. "Did Mama teach you the same signs she taught Caleb?" she asked one evening. "I'm learning from her book," Eleanor said. "The one with her notes in the margins." Rebecca's breath caught. Could I see it?" Eleanor retrieved the book, and Rebecca opened it with hands that trembled slightly. Her fingers traced over Catherine's handwriting, notes about which signs Caleb learned fastest, reminders about hand positions, small observations about his progress. She was always writing things down, Rebecca said, her voice thick. Everything important she'd make notes about. She said memory couldn't be trusted, but paper didn't forget. She was wise. She was perfect. Rebecca's voice cracked, and I can't remember her voice anymore. I try to, but it's gone. I can see her face and remember things she said, but I can't hear how she sounded when she said them. Eleanor's heart broke for this girl who was losing her mother piece by piece to the cruelty of time. "What do you remember about her?" Eleanor asked softly. "Everything. Nothing. Too much and not enough." Rebecca closed the book carefully. She used to sing when she cooked, off-key, but happy. She danced with Mary even when Mary was just a baby who couldn't do anything but wiggle. She read to us every night, all of us together, even when she was tired. She made Papa laugh, really laugh, not just smile. She made everything better just by being there. She sounds wonderful. She was, and now she's gone, and nothing's right anymore, and it never will be again. Rebecca's composure finally shattered. I try so hard to be like her, to keep things the way she would have wanted, but I can't. I'm not her. I'll never be her. Rebecca. Eleanor moved closer, choosing her words with care. Your mother didn't want you to be her. She wanted you to be you, a 12-year-old girl, not a substitute parent. But someone has to. I'm here now. Let me carry some of that weight. Rebecca looked at her with eyes full of tears and desperate hope and lingering suspicion. What if you leave? Then you'll be exactly where you were before I came. But right now, today, I'm here. Let that be enough for now. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was honest, and Rebecca seemed to appreciate that. She nodded slowly and wiped her face. Okay, for now. That night marked a shift. Rebecca began to let Eleanor take on more responsibilities, to stop checking and double-checking everything Eleanor did. The girl still carried too much weight for someone her age, but she'd accepted that she didn't have to carry it alone. The house began to feel different. Not happy exactly. Grief still permeated every corner. But lighter somehow. As if a collective breath had been released. Daniel noticed. Eleanor saw it in the way his eyes tracked the children's interactions with her, assessing and measuring. She saw it in the way he'd pause sometimes, watching her with Caleb or listening to her talk with Thomas, his expression unreadable. One evening, as Eleanor was cleaning up after dinner, Daniel lingered in the kitchen instead of retreating to his study. "You've made a difference here," he said abruptly. Eleanor looked up from the dishes, surprised. "I'm just doing what you hired me for." "No, you're doing more than that." He moved to the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. "The children are different, happier. Even Rebecca is starting to smile again. They're remarkable children. They just needed someone to see that. The other women saw them as burdens, tasks to manage. Then the other women were fools." Daniel turned to look at her, and Eleanor saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not attraction. It was too soon for that, too complicated. But recognition. As if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "Catherine left those notes for you," he said quietly. "I didn't realize it at the time, but that's what she was doing. Leaving instructions for whoever came after, trying to make sure the children would be cared for properly. She loved them very much." "She did, and she'd be grateful to see how you're using her guidance." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "I'm grateful too. I haven't said that yet, but I am." The words hung between them, fragile and important. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," Eleanor said softly. "Daniel," he corrected her almost absently. "When it's just us, you can call me Daniel." It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. "Daniel," Eleanor repeated, testing the name. "Then you should call me Eleanor." He nodded, and something eased in his posture. They stood in the kitchen as darkness fell outside. Two people who'd been strangers weeks ago, now connected by children and grief, and notes left by a dead woman. "Tell me about her," Eleanor said impulsively. "Not just what the notes say. Tell me who Catherine really was." Daniel was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and careful, as if the words might shatter if handled roughly. "She was fierce," he said. "People expected her to be gentle because she was kind, but Catherine was fierce about the things that mattered. her children, her home, justice, and fairness. She couldn't stand seeing anyone treated poorly. Once, in town, she saw a man beating his horse. She marched right up to him, this tiny woman confronting a man twice her size, and told him if she ever saw him mistreat an animal again, she'd make sure everyone in the county knew what kind of man he was. Despite everything, Eleanor smiled. What did he do? Apologized and slunk away. Catherine had that effect on people. You didn't want to disappoint her. His voice softened further. She laughed easily. At herself, at me, at the absurdity of life. When things went wrong, and on a ranch, things always go wrong, she'd find something funny in it. The time the pig got loose and chased Rebecca through the house. The time I tried to cook breakfast and burned everything including the coffee. She'd laugh until she cried, and somehow that made everything bearable. Eleanor listened, building a picture of Catherine Hayes that was richer and more complete than the notes could convey. She sounds extraordinary. She was ordinary, Daniel corrected gently. That's what made her extraordinary. She wasn't trying to be special. She was just trying to love her family and build a good life. But she did it with such completeness, such joy, even when things were hard. You loved her very much. I did. I do. He looked at Eleanor then, really looked at her. I'll never stop loving her. You should know that. I know, Eleanor said, because she did. I'm not here to replace her, Daniel. I'm just here to help you all survive her absence. Survive. He tested the word, turning it over. Yes, that's what we're doing, isn't it? Just surviving. For now. Maybe someday it'll become more than survival. But for now, surviving is enough. Daniel nodded slowly. Catherine would have liked you, he said again. She'd have appreciated your honesty, your strength, the way you see the children for who they really are. I hope so. He moved toward the door, then paused. Eleanor? Yes? Thank you for learning to sign with Caleb, for being patient with Thomas, for understanding Sarah's anger and Rebecca's fear, for all of it. Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in the kitchen with dishes and lamplight and a warmth in her chest that felt dangerously like hope. The winter deepened, bringing storms that buried the ranch in snow and temperatures that made the wind feel like knives. Eleanor learned to navigate life on the frontier, how to keep the fires burning through the night, how to melt snow for water when the pump froze, how to stretch supplies when trips to town became impossible. She learned other things, too. That Daniel was a good father but an exhausted one, carrying guilt over every perceived failure. That Rebecca's perfectionism came from terror of losing control. That Thomas could read if given time and patience, his mind simply worked differently than others. That Sarah's anger protected a heart that felt too much. That Caleb's silence held volumes, and his hands spoke poetry when you learned the language. And slowly, carefully, the Hayes family began to knit Eleanor into their fabric. It happened in small moments, Thomas bringing her his book and asking for help without embarrassment, Sarah seeking her out when nightmares came, Caleb signing mother one day, then catching himself and looking terrified. But Eleanor had just smiled and signed back friend, and his relief had been palpable. Rebecca starting to talk about Catherine without crying, sharing memories instead of grief. Daniel remained complicated. Some days he was almost friendly, working alongside Eleanor with companionable ease. Other days he retreated behind walls of silence, watching her with an expression that suggested he was constantly measuring her against a ghost. Eleanor understood. Catherine Hayes was a hard act to follow, and Eleanor wasn't trying to compete. She was simply trying to be useful. But there were moments, brief, shining moments, when something passed between them that felt like connection. A shared smile when Mary did something adorable. An exchange of glances when one of the children said something unexpectedly wise. The brush of hands when both reached for something simultaneously, followed by a mutual awareness that neither quite knew what to do with. Eleanor told herself it meant nothing. She was an employee. He was her employer. And between them stood the memory of a woman who'd been perfect in every way that mattered. But late at night, when the house was quiet, and Eleanor lay alone in her cold room, she sometimes allowed herself to wonder what might be possible in a different life. In a world where she hadn't been sold like property, where Daniel Hayes was free to see her as something more than hired help, where the ghost of Catherine didn't stand between them like an unbridgeable divide. Those thoughts were dangerous. Eleanor knew better than to entertain them. But sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, she entertained them anyway. And somewhere in the house, 5 children slept more peacefully than they had in over a year. And in his lonely bedroom, Daniel Hayes lay awake and wondered what it meant that he'd started listening for Eleanor's footsteps, started noticing when she smiled, started feeling something besides grief for the first time since Catherine died. He told himself it meant nothing, but his heart, treacherous thing that it was, whispered differently. The storm arrived on a Tuesday morning in early February, announced by a sky the color of old bruises and a wind that screamed across the prairie like something alive and furious. Eleanor had seen storms in Kansas City, but nothing like this. Here, weather didn't just happen. It attacked. "Get the children inside," Daniel said, his voice sharp with urgency as he burst through the door, snow already coating his shoulders. "Now, this one's going to be bad." Eleanor didn't ask questions. She gathered Mary from her cradle and called for the others. Rebecca herded Thomas and Sarah in from the yard where they'd been playing, their faces red with cold and excitement. But Caleb was missing. "Where's Caleb?" Eleanor asked, her stomach dropping. Rebecca's face went white. "He was checking on the chickens. He wanted to make sure they had enough feed before the storm." Daniel was already moving, grabbing his heavy coat from the hook. "How long ago? 10 minutes? Maybe 15? Stay inside, all of you. Bar the door behind me." Daniel's eyes met Eleanor's, and she saw fear there. Real fear. "Don't open it for anyone but me or Caleb." Then he was gone, swallowed by the white fury beyond the door. The storm hit with full force within minutes. Wind hammered the house like fists, rattling windows and finding every crack in the walls. Snow fell so thickly that Eleanor couldn't see past the porch. The world had become nothing but white and howling wind. Rebecca stood frozen by the window, her hands pressed against the glass. "He'll find him. Papa always finds us." But her voice shook, and Eleanor heard the fear beneath the words. "Of course he will," Eleanor said, forcing confidence she didn't feel. She settled Mary in her cradle and moved to the stove, stoking the fire higher. They needed warmth, needed light, needed something to push back against the darkness gathering outside. "Thomas, help me bring in more wood from the box. Sarah, get blankets from the chest upstairs. We need to keep this room as warm as possible for when they get back." Giving the children tasks kept them moving, kept them from standing at the windows watching for their father and brother. Eleanor's own fear was a living thing in her chest, clawing at her throat, but she couldn't let them see it. They needed her steady. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Eleanor moved between the stove and the windows, straining to see anything through the white wall beyond the glass. Where were they? The chicken coop was barely 50 yards from the house. Even in this storm, they should have made it back by now. "Miss Eleanor?" Thomas's voice was small. "What if they can't find the house?" It was a valid fear. In storms like this, people got turned around, lost their bearings. Men had frozen to death 20 feet from their own front doors because they couldn't see through the snow. "Your father knows this land better than anyone," Eleanor said firmly. "He'll get Caleb to safety." But where? If they couldn't make it back to the house, where would Daniel take the boy? The barn. It was closer to the chicken coop and it had walls and some shelter from the wind. Daniel would head there if he couldn't make it back. Eleanor made a decision. She pulled on the heavy coat Daniel had left behind and began wrapping a scarf around her face. "What are you doing?" Rebecca demanded, her voice rising with panic. "I'm going to the barn. If they're sheltering there, they'll need supplies, food, blankets, something warm to drink." "Papa said to stay inside." "And I will, as soon as I make sure your father and brother have what they need to survive until this passes." Eleanor grabbed a basket and began filling it with bread, dried meat, a jar of preserves, a canteen of water. "Rebecca, you're in charge while I'm gone. Keep the fire going. Keep your siblings calm. I'll be back in 10 minutes. "You can't see 10 feet in this storm." "Then I'll feel my way there." "The rope line, does your father have a rope strung between the house and barn?" Rebecca nodded reluctantly. "On the porch, tied to the railing. It runs all the way to the barn door." Smart man. Eleanor had heard of ranchers who strung ropes between buildings for exactly this reason, a lifeline in storms that could kill. She gathered her courage and opened the door. The wind tried to rip it from her hands, and snow blasted into the room like a physical force. Eleanor forced herself through the opening and pulled the door shut behind her, hearing Rebecca throw the bolt. The world was chaos. Wind screamed in her ears, snow stung her exposed skin like needles, and the cold was so intense it hurt to breathe. Eleanor fumbled along the porch railing until her gloved hands found the rope. She gripped it tightly and began pulling herself forward, one hand over the other, the basket clutched against her chest. 10 feet felt like a mile. 20 feet felt like forever. The rope was slick with ice and snow, and Eleanor's hands ached with cold despite the gloves. She couldn't see anything, could barely tell which direction was up. The only thing keeping her grounded was the rope and the knowledge that somewhere ahead, that barn held 2 people she couldn't afford to lose. Her foot hit something solid. The barn wall. Eleanor felt along it until she found the door, hauled it open against the protesting wind, and stumbled inside. The barn was dark and barely warmer than outside, but at least the wind couldn't reach her here. Eleanor stood gasping, her lungs burning from the cold air, her whole body shaking. Then she heard voices. "Eleanor?" Daniel emerged from the shadows, Caleb clutched against his chest. Both were covered in snow, the boy's face buried in his father's coat. Relief flooded through Eleanor so intensely she nearly collapsed. "You shouldn't have come out in this," Daniel said, his voice rough. "You needed supplies." Eleanor set down the basket with shaking hands. "Food, water, blankets? I didn't know if you'd made it here or if you were still out there somewhere." Daniel stared at her as if she'd done something incomprehensible. "You risked your life to bring us food? You risked yours to save Caleb. It seemed only fair." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, gratitude, something deeper that Eleanor couldn't name. He adjusted his hold on Caleb, who was shivering violently, and moved to a pile of hay in the corner. "Help me get him warm. He's been out in this too long." Eleanor unpacked the basket while Daniel wrapped Caleb in blankets she'd brought. The boy's lips were blue, his whole body trembling with cold. Eleanor had seen frostbite before, had seen what extreme cold could do to a person. Terror gripped her, but she forced it down and focused on what needed to be done. "We need to warm him slowly," she said, tucking blankets around the shivering child. "Too fast can be dangerous. Body heat works best." Daniel nodded and pulled Caleb close, rubbing the boy's arms and back through the blankets. Eleanor pressed against Caleb's other side, sandwiching him between their warmth. Slowly, painfully, slowly, color began returning to the child's face. Caleb's hands emerged from the blankets, moving in frantic signs. Eleanor's knowledge was still limited, but she caught enough to understand, scared, cold, sorry. "You have nothing to be sorry for," Eleanor said, catching his small hands between hers and breathing warm air over them. "You were being responsible, checking on the animals. That's admirable. More signs. Lost. Couldn't see. Called for Papa." "I heard you," Daniel said, his voice thick. "I heard you calling and followed your voice. You did exactly right, Caleb." The boy's eyes filled with tears, and he buried his face in his father's chest. Daniel held him tight, one large hand cradling Caleb's head, and Eleanor saw the fear he'd been hiding, the terror of nearly losing another person he loved. They sat together in the hay, warming the child between them, while the storm raged outside with undiminished fury. Time became strange, measured not in minutes, but in the gradual strengthening of Caleb's trembling, the slow return of warmth to his extremities, the easing of the panic in his eyes. "Tell me about Kansas City," Daniel said eventually, his voice quiet beneath the howling wind. "Distract him with a story." Eleanor understood. Caleb needed something besides fear to focus on. So she began talking, describing the boarding house where she'd grown up, the parade of tenants who'd passed through, the adventures and misadventures of city life. She kept her voice calm and steady, weaving words into a blanket of normalcy. Caleb's shivering gradually subsided. His hands stopped their frantic movements and relaxed. He turned his head to watch Eleanor as she spoke, and she saw intelligence in those large eyes, curiosity breaking through the fear. "There was one tenant," Eleanor said, "a magician who claimed he could make anything disappear. He was quite dramatic about it. Top hat, cape, the whole performance. One evening, he made dinner disappear right off the table. We were all very impressed until we found him in the kitchen an hour later, eating the roast he'd vanished." Caleb's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "My aunt was not amused," Eleanor continued. "She made him pay for 2 weeks' room and board as compensation for the roast. He tried to make himself disappear after that, but unfortunately he was better at hiding food than hiding himself. This time Caleb did smile, and Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. They stayed in the barn for hours. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Daniel refused to risk the journey back to the house until conditions improved. He rationed out the food Eleanor had brought, and they ate in the growing darkness, listening to the wind scream its fury. "The children will be worried," Eleanor said. "Rebecca will keep them calm. She's stronger than she looks." "She's 12. She shouldn't have to be that strong." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "No, she shouldn't, but life doesn't care what should or shouldn't be." Eleanor heard the bitterness beneath his words, the grief that never quite left him. "Tell me about the day you met Catherine," she said impulsively. Daniel's head snapped toward her. "Why?" "Because we're stuck in a barn in a blizzard, and I'd rather hear about happier times than sit in silence thinking about how cold I am." He studied her face in the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls. Then, surprisingly, he began to speak. It was at a barn raising. Her father's barn had burned down, and the community came together to build a new one. I was 19, thought I knew everything. Catherine was 17, and she actually did know everything, though she was kind enough not to lord it over people. Despite everything, Eleanor smiled. That sounded exactly like the woman from the notes. "I tried to impress her by volunteering for the most dangerous jobs," Daniel continued. "Climbing to the highest beams, handling the heaviest loads. I was young and stupid and convinced that risking my neck would make her notice me. Did it work?" "She noticed me all right, noticed me being an idiot. Finally, she marched right up to me and said, 'Daniel Hayes, if you fall and break your fool neck, I'm going to be very annoyed with you.'" His voice softened with memory. "Then she handed me a cup of water and told me to take a break before I hurt myself or someone else. And you fell in love right there." "Not right there. That came later when I realized she wasn't trying to manage me or change me. She just saw who I was, flaws and all, and decided I was worth keeping anyway." He paused. "That's a rare gift, being seen completely and still being wanted." Eleanor's throat tightened. She understood that longing better than he knew. To be seen. To be wanted. Not for what you could provide or how useful you were, but simply for who you were. "She was lucky to have you too," Eleanor said quietly. "The way you loved her, love her still, that's rare too." Daniel looked at her, and something in his expression made Eleanor's breath catch. "Is it? Loving someone completely? Seems like it should be ordinary." "Should be. Isn't." They fell into silence again, but it was different now. More comfortable. Less like strangers forced together by circumstance and more like two people who'd survived something together and come out changed. Caleb had fallen asleep between them, exhausted by fear and cold and the slow return to warmth. Eleanor stroked his hair gently, marveling at how small he was, how fragile. Any of them could be lost so easily. Life on the frontier was unforgiving. "Thank you," Daniel said suddenly, "for coming out here, for bringing supplies, for helping with Caleb." "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You could have stayed safe in the house. Instead, you risked yourself for us. That means something." Eleanor met his eyes. "You're not just my employer, Daniel. None of you are just obligations. You're—" She struggled for words that wouldn't reveal too much. "You're important." The barn seemed to shrink around them, the space between them feeling suddenly charged with something Eleanor didn't dare name. Daniel's gaze held hers, and she saw surprise there, and something else. Something that made her heart race despite the cold. "Eleanor." A gust of wind hit the barn so hard the walls shuddered. The spell broke, and they both looked away, the moment passing, but not forgotten. "We should try to get back soon," Daniel said, his voice rougher than before the children convince themselves we've frozen to death. "Is it safe?" He moved to the door and peered out through the cracks. "The wind's dying down. Snow's still falling, but I can see about 10 feet now. If we move fast and stay on the rope line, we can make it." They bundled Caleb in every blanket they had, and Daniel lifted the boy into his arms. Eleanor gathered the empty basket, and they prepared to face the storm again. The journey back to the house was brutal, but mercifully short. The rope line held firm, and they followed it hand over hand until the house materialized out of the white. The door flew open before they reached it. Rebecca must have been watching, and suddenly there were children everywhere crying and reaching for them, helping them inside. "You came back," Sarah sobbed, throwing her arms around Eleanor's waist. "You came back! You came back!" Eleanor held the girl close, surprised by the fierceness of the embrace. Over Sarah's head, she saw Rebecca watching with tears streaming down her face, and Thomas hovering nearby with wide, relieved eyes. "Of course we came back," Eleanor said, though her voice shook. "Did you think a little snow would stop us?" "Mama didn't come back," Sarah said into Eleanor's coat. "She went away and she didn't come back." The pain in those words nearly broke Eleanor's heart. She knelt so she was at Sarah's level and took the girl's face between her cold hands. "I know, and I know that's terrifying. But I'm here, Sarah. I came back. And I'll keep coming back as many times as it takes for you to believe it." Sarah searched her face, looking for lies or false promises. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded and let Eleanor pull her close again. Daniel carried Caleb to the fire, and they all worked together to warm him properly. Rebecca made hot tea with honey. Thomas brought extra blankets. Sarah refused to leave Eleanor's side, her small hand gripping Eleanor's skirt as if afraid she might disappear. As warmth and safety settled over the room, the crisis passing into memory, Eleanor looked around at this family she'd stumbled into. These children who'd lost so much. This man who carried grief like stones in his pockets. This house that had been so cold and is now filling with something that felt dangerously like hope. And she realized with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying that somewhere along the way she'd stopped thinking of this as a job. Stopped counting down the days until her contract ended. These people had become hers to protect, hers to care for, hers to love, if she was brave enough to admit it. The storm raged outside for 2 more days, trapping them all in the house together. Those days became a strange kind of gift. With nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait out the weather, the family turned inward, filling the hours with stories and games and the kind of comfortable togetherness that can only exist when the outside world has disappeared. Rebecca taught Eleanor to play chess using a set that had belonged to Catherine. "Mama loved chess," she said, setting up the pieces with careful precision. She said it taught you to think 3 moves ahead, to see consequences before they happened. Sounds like she was good at it. She never lost, not to anyone. Rebecca moved her first pawn. Papa stopped playing with her because she always won. It frustrated him. "I heard that," Daniel called from across the room, where he was reading to the younger children. Rebecca actually smiled. "You know it's true." Over the next hour, Rebecca thoroughly trounced Eleanor in 3 consecutive games. But she did it with such patient instruction that Eleanor didn't mind losing. This was Rebecca teaching, Rebecca sharing something her mother had taught her, and that was worth more than any victory. Thomas overcame his shyness enough to read aloud from his favorite book, stumbling over words but pushing through with determination. When he finished the chapter, Eleanor applauded, and his face lit up with pride. Sarah convinced everyone to play a game of her own invention that seemed to involve running around the room and making up rules as she went along. It was chaotic and nonsensical, but it got them all moving and laughing, and that was what mattered. Even Caleb emerged from his shell, teaching the whole family signs he knew. By the end of the second day, they could all sign basic greetings and needs. It wasn't fluent communication, but it was enough for Caleb to feel included in conversations, to have his siblings ask him questions in his own language. Daniel watched all of this with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Sometimes she'd catch him staring at her with something like wonder, as if she'd done something miraculous instead of simply playing with children on a snowy afternoon. On the 3rd morning, they woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. Snow had drifted against the house up to the windows, and the landscape outside looked like another planet, beautiful and deadly and utterly transformed. "We need to dig out," Daniel said, surveying the damage. "Check on the animals, make sure the barn roof held clear paths to the outbuildings." It was backbreaking work. They shoveled in shifts, fighting through drifts that came up to Eleanor's waist. The cold was vicious, sneaking through layers of clothing and stealing warmth from extremities. But slowly, gradually, they reclaimed their space from the snow. The barn had held, and most of the animals had survived. They'd lost 2 chickens to the cold, but the cows and horses were fine, hungry, and irritated, but alive. It could have been so much worse. That evening, exhausted and sore, they gathered for dinner. The mood was subdued but grateful. They'd survived. All of them. together. To Eleanor, Daniel said suddenly, raising his cup of water in an unexpected toast, who risked the storm to bring supplies to a man and boy who needed them. Papa, Eleanor started, embarrassed. No, let me finish. He looked at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You could have stayed safe. You chose to brave the storm instead. That kind of courage deserves recognition. The children raised their cups, echoing their father. Eleanor felt her face flush, unused to such direct acknowledgement. I just did what needed doing, she said quietly. Exactly, Daniel replied. You saw what needed doing and you did it, without hesitation, without expecting reward or recognition. That's who you are, Eleanor Whitfield, and this family is lucky to have you. The words settled over the table like a blessing. Rebecca smiled at her, a real smile, warm and genuine. Thomas nodded enthusiastically. Sarah reached over and squeezed Eleanor's hand. Caleb signed thank you with careful precision. And Eleanor, who'd spent most of her life feeling unwanted and unnecessary, felt something shift inside her chest. A wall crumbling, a door opening, hope taking root where there had only been resignation before. That night, as she climbed the stairs to her room, Daniel caught her arm gently. Eleanor, wait. She turned, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. Yes? He seemed to struggle with words, his jaw working as if the speech required physical effort. I need you to know something, he finally said. When I hired you, I was looking for help. Someone to cook and clean and keep the children fed. That's all. Eleanor's heart sank. This was it. The speech where he reminded her of her place, where he made sure she didn't get ideas above her station. But you've become more than that, Daniel continued, and the sinking feeling reversed, becoming something else entirely. You've become part of this family. The children love you. They trust you. And He stopped, seemed to reconsider, started again. I'm grateful for you. More than I know how to express. You don't need to be grateful. This is my job. Is it? He looked at her searchingly. Is that all this is to you? A job? The question hung between them, dangerous and thrilling. Eleanor knew the safe answer, the appropriate answer. She should say yes, should maintain professional distance, should remember that she was hired help and nothing more. Instead, she told the truth. No, she said quietly. It stopped being just a job weeks ago. Daniel's breath caught. His hand was still on her arm, and Eleanor felt the warmth of it through her sleeve. They stood in the dim hallway, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could count the gray hairs beginning to thread through his beard. Eleanor, Whatever he was going to say was interrupted by footsteps on the stairs. Rebecca appeared, concern on her face. Papa? Mary's fussing. I think she might be getting sick. The moment shattered. Daniel released Eleanor's arm and immediately shifted into father mode. Show me. He followed Rebecca upstairs, leaving Eleanor alone in the hallway with her racing heart and the echo of words that had almost been spoken. She made her way to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling. What was happening here? What was this connection growing between her and Daniel Hayes? And what was she supposed to do about it? Catherine's ghost still walked these halls. Her notes guided Eleanor's days. Her children called for her in their sleep. Her husband still loved her with a devotion that death hadn't diminished. There was no room in this house for Eleanor's feelings, no space for the dangerous hope beginning to bloom in her chest. She needed to remember that, needed to guard her heart before it was too late. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the house settle around her, Eleanor couldn't quite convince herself that it wasn't already too late. Her heart, stubborn and foolish, had already made its choice, and there was no going back from that. Mary's fussing turned into a full fever by morning. Eleanor woke to the sound of the baby's cries, not the usual demands for food or attention, but weak, plaintive whimpers that sent ice through her veins. She threw on her robe and rushed downstairs to find Daniel pacing with Mary against his shoulder, his face drawn with worry. She's burning up, he said without preamble. Started a few hours ago. I've been trying to keep her cool, but the fever won't break. Eleanor crossed to them and placed her hand on Mary's forehead. The child was indeed blazing hot, her small face flushed and her eyes glassy. Has she had anything to drink? She won't take the bottle, won't take anything. Fear wrapped around Eleanor's heart and squeezed. She'd seen fever take people before. Her own mother had died this way, burning up from the inside while helpless loved ones watched. But Mary was so small, so fragile. She couldn't fight illness the way an adult could. "We need to cool her down gradually," Eleanor said, forcing her voice to remain calm even as panic clawed at her throat. "Not too fast. That can be dangerous. Tepid water, not cold. And we need to get fluids into her somehow." They worked through the morning in quiet desperation. Eleanor bathed Mary's face and arms with barely warm water, while Daniel tried coaxing her to drink. The other children hovered nearby, their faces pale with fear. Rebecca kept the younger ones occupied with lessons, but her eyes constantly drifted to her baby sister. By afternoon, Mary's fever had climbed higher. She'd stopped crying, which was somehow worse than the whimpering. Now she just lay limp in Eleanor's arms, her breathing shallow and rapid. "We need a doctor," Eleanor said. Daniel's jaw clenched. "Nearest doctor is in town. That's a full day's ride in good conditions. With the snow this deep, maybe 2 days. And I can't leave the rest of you alone that long. Then I'll go." "Absolutely not." "Daniel," I said no. His voice was sharp with fear masquerading as authority. "You don't know the route. You don't know the dangers. You could get lost, freeze, or worse." "Then what do you suggest? We just sit here and watch her die?" The words came out harsher than Eleanor intended, but they needed to be said. Daniel flinched as if struck, and Eleanor saw the terror in his eyes. He'd already lost his wife. The thought of losing his youngest child, too, was clearly destroying him. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said more gently, "but we need help. If you can't go and I can't go, then we need to figure out another solution. Fast." Rebecca spoke up from the corner where she'd been pretending to read. "Old Mrs. Patterson. She lives about 3 miles north. She's delivered half the babies in the county and treated every illness you can name. Mama always said she was better than any doctor." Hope flickered in Daniel's face. "That's still a dangerous ride in this snow." "Not as dangerous as doing nothing," Eleanor said. She stood, still cradling Mary. "Tell me how to get there." "I'll go," Daniel said. "You're needed here. The children need their father, and if something happens to me, you'll still be here to take care of them. If something happens to you." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, conflict clear on his face. Then reluctantly, he nodded. "The road north. Follow it exactly. Don't deviate, or you'll end up lost in the fields. Patterson's place is a white farmhouse with green shutters, right side of the road. You can't miss it if you stay on the path." Within 20 minutes, Eleanor was bundled in every warm thing she could find and mounted on Daniel's gentlest horse. Mary remained with her father, too sick to be moved. Eleanor's heart ached to leave the baby, but getting help was more important than staying close. "Be careful," Daniel said, his hand on the horse's bridle. His eyes met Eleanor's with an intensity that stole her breath. "Come back safe." "I will." "Eleanor." He gripped her hand where it rested on the saddle. "I mean it. Come back." The desperation in his voice spoke of more than just needing help with his daughter. Eleanor squeezed his hand once, then urged the horse forward before she could do something foolish, like promise things she had no right to promise. The journey was brutal. Snow had drifted across the road in places, forcing Eleanor to navigate around obstacles while trying to maintain the correct direction. The cold was vicious, seeping through her layers and making her extremities ache. The horse plodded steadily forward, but Eleanor could feel its reluctance, its desire to turn back toward the warm barn. She kept going. Mary's feverish face haunted her, those children's frightened eyes, Daniel's desperate plea to come back safe. All of it drove her forward through the frozen landscape. The white farmhouse with green shutters appeared like a miracle after what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes. Eleanor dismounted on shaking legs and pounded on the door. An elderly woman answered, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and her sharp eyes taking in Eleanor's desperate state immediately. "You're the new girl at the Hayes place." "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs. Patterson?" "That's me. What's wrong?" "Mary, the baby. She has a terrible fever. Won't drink, barely responsive. We need help." Mrs. Patterson didn't waste time with questions. She turned and bellowed into the house. "Samuel! Hitch the sleigh!" Medical emergency at Hayes Ranch. Within minutes, they were racing back toward the ranch, Mrs. Patterson's sleigh moving much faster than Eleanor's horse had managed. The old woman drove with competent efficiency, her wrinkled hands steady on the reins. "How long has she had the fever?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Started last night. Got worse through the morning." "Any other symptoms? Rash, cough, difficulty breathing?" Eleanor described everything she'd observed, and Mrs. Patterson listened with the focused attention of someone who'd seen 1,000 illnesses and knew how to separate serious from survivable. "Could be several things," the old woman said. "Most likely just a bad cold that's hit her hard because she's so young. But we won't know until I examine her." They arrived back at the ranch to find Daniel pacing the porch with Mary still in his arms. Rebecca stood in the doorway, her face tight with worry. The moment they stopped, Mrs. Patterson was out of the sleigh and up the steps, her medical bag in hand. "Inside, now. I need good light and a clean surface to examine her." The next hour passed in tense silence. Mrs. Patterson examined Mary with thorough precision, checking her temperature, listening to her breathing, looking at her throat and ears. The children clustered together on one side of the room, while Daniel hovered nearby, clearly torn between wanting to help and knowing he'd just be in the way. Eleanor made tea. Nobody drank, and tried to keep her own fear under control. Finally, Mrs. Patterson straightened. "It's an ear infection, bad one. That's what's causing the fever. The good news is it's treatable. The bad news is she's going to feel miserable for several days while it clears." Relief flooded the room like a physical presence. Daniel's shoulders sagged, and he had to sit down suddenly as if his legs had given out. Rebecca started crying quietly. Thomas hugged Sarah, who for once didn't push him away. "What do we need to do?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Patterson pulled bottles from her bag. "Willow bark tea for the fever. 3 drops of this tincture in warm water 4 times a day. It'll help with the infection. Keep her hydrated however you can manage it, and keep her warm but not too warm. The fever needs to break naturally, but we can help it along." She showed Eleanor exactly how to prepare everything, writing down instructions in case memory failed. Then she turned to Daniel with a stern expression. "You're lucky Eleanor had the sense to come get me. Another day of that fever climbing and that baby might not have made it. When children get sick out here, you don't wait. You get help immediately. Understand?" Daniel nodded, chastened. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "You're doing a good job, Daniel, all things considered, but you can't do it alone. No one can." Her eyes moved to Eleanor. "This one's got a good head on her shoulders. Listen to her." After Mrs. Patterson left with promises to check back in 2 days, the household slowly returned to some semblance of normal. Mary took the medicine without too much fuss, and by evening her fever had dropped slightly. She still felt hot to the touch, but the glassy look had left her eyes, and she managed to take some water from a spoon. Eleanor tended to her through the night, refusing to leave the baby's side. She dozed in the rocking chair near Mary's cradle, waking every hour to check the fever, administer medicine, and try to coax more fluids into the child. It was exhausting work, but Eleanor had never felt more needed or more determined. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, she felt a blanket settle over her shoulders. She looked up to find Daniel standing there, his face haggard in the lamplight. "You should sleep," he said quietly. "So should you." "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see her getting worse. I see Catherine all over again." His voice broke on his wife's name. "I can't lose another one, Eleanor. I can't." Eleanor stood and guided him to the chair she'd vacated. "You won't. Mary's going to be fine. Mrs. Patterson said so, and that woman knows what she's talking about." "But what if—" "No. No what ifs. Not tonight." Eleanor knelt beside the chair so she could look directly into his eyes. "Mary is going to get better. You're going to watch her grow up. She's going to drive you crazy as a teenager and make you proud when she's grown. But tonight, she's sick, and she needs you to believe she'll recover. Can you do that?" Daniel stared at her, and Eleanor saw the moment he chose hope over fear. It was a visible shift, something settling in his expression. He nodded slowly. "I can do that." "Good. Now check on her while I make fresh tea." They fell into a routine over the next few days, trading off Mary's care in shifts so no one became too exhausted. Rebecca handled most of the household tasks with quiet efficiency, proving once again that she was far more capable than any 12-year-old should have to be. Thomas helped with the animals. Sarah entertained Caleb when the forced indoor time became too much for the energetic boy. And slowly, gradually, Mary improved. Her fever broke on the third day, and she woke crying, not the weak whimpers of illness, but strong, demanding cries that said she was hungry and annoyed and very much alive. Eleanor had never been so happy to hear a baby scream. "There she is," Eleanor said, lifting Mary from the cradle. "There's our girl." Mary latched onto the bottle Eleanor offered and drank with single-minded determination, making up for days of barely eating. Color returned to her cheeks. Brightness returned to her eyes. By evening, she was babbling and grabbing at Eleanor's face with her usual enthusiasm. That night, the family celebrated with a special dinner. It wasn't elaborate, just stew and fresh bread, but the mood was light in a way it hadn't been since before the storm. The children laughed. Daniel smiled. Even Rebecca looked relaxed, the tight worry lines easing from her young face. "To Mary," Thomas said, raising his cup in imitation of his father's earlier toast. "For getting better and not dying." "Thomas," Rebecca scolded, but she was smiling. "What? It's true." They all drank to Mary, who watched the proceedings from Eleanor's lap with an expression of regal satisfaction, as if she'd planned the entire dramatic episode for their entertainment. After the children went to bed, Eleanor and Daniel sat together in the kitchen, tired but content. The house felt peaceful, as if the crisis had somehow cleansed it of lingering grief. "You saved her life," Daniel said into the comfortable silence. "Mrs. Patterson saved her life. I just fetched her." "You rode through dangerous conditions to get help. That took courage." Eleanor shook her head. "It took necessity. There was no other choice." "There's always another choice. You could have insisted I go instead. You could have argued or delayed, but you didn't. You saw what needed doing, and you did it." He paused, his eyes finding hers across the table. "You're always doing that, seeing what's needed and acting without hesitation. Someone has to." "Yes, but it doesn't have to be you. Yet it always is." His voice dropped lower, more intimate. "Why is that, Eleanor? Why do you care so much about a family that isn't yours?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. Eleanor could deflect, could give a safe answer about duty or the terms of her contract, but she was tired of safe answers, tired of pretending she didn't feel what she felt. "They feel like mine," she said quietly. "Somewhere along the way, all of you started feeling like mine to protect, mine to care for, mine to love." She hadn't meant to say that last word. It slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw Daniel's expression shift, surprise, then something deeper, something that made her heart race. "Eleanor, I know I have no right to feel that way," she continued quickly, needing to say it all before she lost her courage. "I know I'm just the hired help. I know Catherine was perfect, and I'm not trying to replace her or compete with her memory, but I can't help how I feel about these children, about this family, about—" She stopped, unable to finish. "About me?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's breath caught. She should deny it, should laugh it off as a misunderstanding, should protect herself from the inevitable rejection. Instead, she met his eyes and told the truth. "Yes, about you." The silence that followed felt eternal. Daniel stared at her, his face unreadable, and Eleanor waited for him to remind her of her place, to tell her she'd overstepped, to make it clear that his heart belonged to a ghost, and there was no room for anyone else. "I loved Catherine," he said finally. "I loved her completely, and I'll never stop loving her. She was my whole world for years." Eleanor's heart cracked. This was the rejection she'd expected. She started to stand, to excuse herself before the tears came. "But she's gone!" Daniel's voice stopped her. "And I'm still here, and you're here, and I don't know what to do with that." Eleanor sank back into her chair, hardly daring to breathe. "These past months," Daniel continued, "watching you with the children, seeing how you care for them, how you've brought light back into this house. It's made me feel things I thought I'd never feel again, things I had no right to feel." "What kind of things?" Eleanor whispered. He stood and crossed to her, kneeling so they were at eye level. His hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle and uncertain. "Hope, possibility, the chance that maybe, someday, I could love again." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "Daniel, I'm not ready yet," he said, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I don't know when I will be. The grief is still so strong, and Catherine's memory is everywhere. But you, Eleanor Whitfield, you make me want to try. You make me believe there might be a future beyond just surviving." Eleanor covered his hand with hers, holding it against her face. "I don't need you to be ready now. I don't need promises or declarations. I just need you to know that I'm here, that I care, that I'm not going anywhere. Your contract ends in a few months. Contracts can be extended." Something sparked in his eyes, hope, bright and fragile. "You'd stay? Even though there's no guarantee of anything beyond what we have now?" "I'd stay for the children," Eleanor said. "I'd stay for this family. I'd stay for the chance that someday you might be ready for more." Daniel searched her face, and Eleanor let him see everything, her hope, her fear, her love. She had nothing left to hide. "You're remarkable," he said finally. "Catherine would have loved you. She'd have seen exactly what you are, strong and brave and endlessly kind. She'd have wanted this for us, for the children." "You think so?" "I know so. The notes she left, they weren't just instructions, they were permission. Permission to move forward, permission to find happiness again, permission to let someone else love this family the way she did." The weight of that realization settled over them both. Catherine Hayes, in her final days, had thought not just of her children's immediate needs, but of their future. She'd left breadcrumbs for someone to follow, someone who could step into the gaps her death would leave. She'd prepared the way for Eleanor without knowing who Eleanor would be. "I won't let her down," Eleanor said, her voice fierce with determination. "I'll honor her memory by caring for these children the way she would have wanted, by being here when they need me, by loving them with everything I have." "I know you will." Daniel stood, pulling Eleanor up with him. For a moment they stood close, his hand still holding hers, and Eleanor thought he might kiss her. She wanted him to, wanted it with an intensity that surprised her. But Daniel stepped back, putting distance between them. "Not yet," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "I need time. We need time. But someday—" "Someday," Eleanor agreed. "I can wait for someday." They parted then, each heading to their separate rooms, but everything had changed. The air between them felt charged with possibility. The future, once a vague uncertainty, now held shape and promise. Eleanor lay in bed that night and let herself imagine it. A real future here. Not as hired help, but as something more. A mother to these children who'd already claimed her heart. A partner to the man downstairs who'd finally allowed himself to hope again. It wouldn't be easy. Grief didn't disappear overnight, and Catherine's memory would always be part of this family. But Eleanor wasn't trying to erase the past. She was trying to build a future that honored it, while creating space for new love, new possibilities, new beginnings. She fell asleep with tears on her face and hope in her heart. And for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she dreamed of staying forever. Downstairs, Daniel sat in his study, Catherine's photograph in his hands. He traced the lines of her face, remembering her laugh, her warmth, the way she'd made everything better just by existing. "I miss you," he whispered to the image. "Every single day I miss you. But Eleanor, she's special, Catherine. She's not trying to replace you. She's just trying to help us survive losing you, and she's doing such a good job of it. The children love her." Mary reaches for her first thing in the morning. Caleb trusts her. Sarah opens up to her. Even Rebecca is letting her in. He paused, gathering courage to say what came next. "I think I could love her. Not the way I loved you. That was unique, irreplaceable. But in a different way. A way that doesn't diminish what we had but acknowledges what we could have." His voice broke. "Would you be angry? Would you hate me for moving forward?" The photograph, of course, offered no answer. But in the silence, Daniel remembered something Catherine had said years ago when they'd heard news of a widower remarrying. "If something happened to me, I'd want you to find happiness again. I'd want the children to have a mother who loves them. Don't you dare spend the rest of your life alone out of misplaced loyalty to my memory." He'd laughed and told her nothing was going to happen to her. They'd grow old together, watch their grandchildren, and die peacefully in their sleep decades from now. But she'd been serious, gripping his hand tight. "Promise me, Daniel. Promise that if something happens, you won't shut yourself off from love. The children will need that. You'll need that. He'd promised, never believing he'd have to keep that promise. Now, sitting in the dark with her photograph, Daniel whispered, I'm trying, Catherine. I'm trying to keep that promise. Eleanor makes it possible. She makes me believe I can do this without betraying your memory. He set the photograph back on his desk and left the study, but his heart felt lighter than it had in months. The future was still uncertain, still complicated. But for the first time since Catherine's death, it held something besides endless grief. It held possibility. And that, Daniel thought, was worth fighting for. The weeks following their conversation settled into something new. Not quite courtship, but no longer just employer and employee. Daniel found excuses to linger in the kitchen while Eleanor cooked. Eleanor caught herself watching him work in the yard, admiring the strength in his movements. They spoke more freely now, sharing stories from their pasts, laughing at small jokes, allowing silences to stretch into comfortable companionship rather than awkward gaps. The children noticed. Thomas whispered to Sarah one morning that Papa smiled more now. Rebecca watched Eleanor and her father with cautious approval, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this but needed to make sure it was real before she fully believed it. Even Caleb seemed more relaxed, signing his thoughts more freely, his small world expanding now that the adults around him had stopped carrying quite so much visible grief. March arrived with the first hints of spring. Snow began melting in patches, revealing brown grass underneath. The air lost some of its vicious bite. Birds returned, filling mornings with sound that had been absent all winter. The ranch slowly came back to life, and with it hope bloomed in ways Eleanor had stopped allowing herself to imagine. It was during the first week of March that Eleanor's aunt arrived. The woman appeared without warning on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a rented buggy and wearing an expression of grim determination. Eleanor was in the yard hanging laundry when she spotted the approaching vehicle, and her stomach dropped with immediate recognition. She'd know that pinched face and severe posture anywhere. "Aunt Margaret?" Eleanor said as the woman climbed down from the buggy, her voice carefully neutral despite the panic rising in her chest. "Eleanor." Margaret Whitfield surveyed the ranch with visible distaste, her lips pursing at the modest buildings and muddy yard. "So this is where you've been hiding yourself?" "I haven't been hiding. I've been working, as per the contract you arranged." "Yes, about that." Margaret smoothed her skirts and fixed Eleanor with the same look she'd used when Eleanor was a child caught in some minor transgression. "The circumstances have changed. I've come to take you home." Eleanor's blood went cold. "Home? You don't have a home anymore. You sold the boarding house." "I've purchased a new establishment in Denver, smaller but respectable, and I need help running it, family help. You'll come with me immediately." "No." The word came out stronger than Eleanor felt. Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Excuse me?" "I said no. I have a contract here. 1 year of service, and I've only completed 4 months. I'm staying until the contract is fulfilled." "The contract can be dissolved. I spoke with Mr. Hayes' lawyer in town. For a fee, we can terminate the agreement early. I'm prepared to pay it." Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This was exactly what she'd feared, someone coming to take away the life she'd built, the family she'd found, the future she'd started to believe in. "I don't want to leave," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "These people need me. These people are not your family. They're strangers who've taken advantage of your labor. You owe them nothing beyond what the contract stipulates, and I'm offering to buy out that contract. You should be grateful." "Grateful?" Anger sparked in Eleanor's chest, hot and righteous. "You sold me like property to settle debts I didn't create. You shipped me hundreds of miles from everything I knew without asking what I wanted. And now you show up demanding I uproot myself again because it's convenient for you? Where in any of that should I feel grateful?" Margaret's face flushed with indignation. "How dare you speak to me that way? I took you in when your parents died. I fed you, housed you, gave you purpose. This is how you repay my kindness. You gave me work in exchange for room and board. That's not kindness. That's a business arrangement. The same business arrangement I have here, except these people actually value me as a person, not just a set of hands." "Value you?" Margaret's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Dear girl, don't mistake necessity for affection. They need a housekeeper. Once they find someone better qualified, you'll be discarded just as quickly as I discarded you." The words hit like physical blows, striking at Eleanor's deepest fears. What if Margaret was right? What if this was all temporary? What if Daniel's gentle words and the children's affection were just products of convenience rather than genuine care? "What's going on here?" Both women turned to see Daniel striding across the yard, his expression dark with concern and anger. He'd clearly heard at least part of the conversation, and he looked ready for a fight. "Mr. Hayes," Margaret said, smoothing her features into something approximating pleasantness. "I'm Margaret Whitfield, Eleanor's aunt. I've come to collect her." "Collect her? She's not property." "Of course not. But she is family, and I need her assistance with my new business venture in Denver. I'm prepared to compensate you for the early termination of your contract." Daniel looked at Eleanor, and she saw the question in his eyes. "What do you want? Not what does your aunt want or what's convenient, but what do you actually want?" Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but Margaret cut her off. "The girl has no choice in this matter. She's 19 years old, unmarried, with no means to support herself independently. I'm her legal guardian, and I'm exercising my right to—" "She's not a child." Daniel's voice was cold steel. "And last I checked, 19 is old enough to make her own decisions. So why don't we let Eleanor speak for herself instead of talking around her like she's not standing right here?" Margaret sputtered with indignation, but Daniel ignored her, his attention fixed on Eleanor. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. Eleanor looked at her aunt, the woman who'd raised her with duty but never love, who'd shipped her away the moment she became inconvenient, who now wanted to reclaim her like a misplaced possession. Then she looked at the house behind Daniel, where 5 children waited, where Rebecca would be starting dinner soon, where Thomas would be struggling through his reading, where Sarah would be looking for someone to listen to her fierce opinions, where Caleb would be moving his hands in the language Eleanor had learned just for him, where Mary would be waking from her nap, reaching for Eleanor with small, trusting hands, where Daniel Hayes stood watching her with an expression that said he'd respect whatever choice she made, even if it meant losing her. "I want to stay," Eleanor said, and with those words, something clicked into place. This wasn't just about fulfilling a contract anymore. This was about choosing her own future for the first time in her life. "I'm staying here until my year is complete. After that, if Mr. Hayes agrees, I'd like to extend my employment indefinitely." Relief flooded Daniel's face, so obvious and complete that Eleanor's heart swelled. "Your employment can be extended as long as you want it," he said. "Years, if that's what you choose." Margaret's face darkened with fury. "This is absurd. Eleanor, be reasonable. You can't seriously mean to bury yourself on this provincial ranch when I'm offering you a respectable position in a real city." "I am being reasonable. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing what I want instead of accepting what others decide for me. And I choose this ranch, these people, this life." "You're making a terrible mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." Margaret stared at her niece as if seeing a stranger, which perhaps she was. The Eleanor who'd left Kansas City 4 months ago would have acquiesced, would have packed her bag and followed obediently. But that Eleanor had been worn down by years of being told she was burden, that her value existed only in her usefulness. This Eleanor knew better. This Eleanor had been valued for who she was, not just what she could do. And that had changed everything. "If you refuse to come with me now," Margaret said coldly, "don't expect me to take you back when this arrangement inevitably falls apart. You'll be on your own. I understand. You'll regret this." "I doubt it." Margaret gathered her skirts with sharp, angry movements. "Fine. Waste your life in this wilderness. But don't come crying to me when you realize your mistake." She climbed back into the buggy and fixed Eleanor with one last venomous look. "You were always ungrateful. Your mother was the same way. Stubbornness runs in your blood, and it will ruin you just like it ruined her." Eleanor flinched at the mention of her mother, but she didn't back down. "Goodbye, Aunt Margaret." The buggy rolled away, carrying Margaret Whitfield out of Eleanor's life, hopefully forever. Eleanor watched until it disappeared from view, her whole body trembling with adrenaline and relief and terror at what she'd just done. She'd burned her bridges, severed her last connection to her old life, put all her faith in a family she'd known for only 4 months, and a man who'd been clear that he wasn't ready for more than friendship. She'd gambled everything on hope. Eleanor. Daniel's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and solid. Are you all right? I don't know, she said honestly. I just told my only living relative to leave without me. I have no backup plan, no safety net. If this doesn't work out, it will work out. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise that you'll always have a place here. Even if circumstances change, even if... He paused, seeming to struggle with words. You're family now, Eleanor. Not because of a contract, but because of who you are and what you mean to us. That doesn't change. Eleanor turned to face him and saw truth in his eyes. Not romantic promises or declarations of love, but something just as valuable, genuine acceptance. A place where she belonged not because she was useful, but because she was wanted. Thank you, she whispered. Daniel nodded, his hand still warm on her shoulder. Then, in a gesture that felt monumental despite its simplicity, he pulled her into a brief embrace. Just a moment of contact, but it steadied Eleanor's shaking foundation and reminded her that she hadn't made this choice alone. When they pulled apart, Rebecca was standing on the porch watching them. Her young face was serious, but there was approval in her eyes. Did that woman leave? Rebecca asked. Yes, Eleanor said. Good. We didn't like her. Rebecca turned and went back inside, and Eleanor found herself smiling despite everything. That evening, Daniel gathered the children in the main room. He stood by the fireplace with an unusual formality that caught everyone's attention. I want to talk to you all about something important, he said. About Eleanor. Eleanor's heart started racing. She sat in her usual chair with Mary on her lap, suddenly uncertain what was coming. Eleanor's contract with us was for 1 year, Daniel continued. But today she made a choice. She chose to stay here even when she had the option to leave. She chose us. And we think, he looked at Eleanor and she saw vulnerability in his expression. We'd like to make that choice permanent. What does that mean? Sarah asked. Daniel took a breath. It means I'm asking Eleanor if she'd like to become part of this family. Not as hired help, but as... He paused, gathering courage. As my wife. And your mother. The room went utterly silent. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling. This was not what she'd expected. They'd agreed to wait, to give Daniel time to grieve properly, to let whatever was growing between them develop naturally. Papa? Rebecca's voice was small and uncertain. Daniel knelt so he was at eye level with his children. I know this seems sudden, and I know you all miss your mother. I miss her too, every single day. But Eleanor has brought light back into this house. She's cared for all of you, loved all of you, put your needs before her own again and again. She's proven that she's here to stay, not just because of a contract, but because she chooses us. He stood and crossed to Eleanor, taking her free hand in his. I'm not asking you to forget Catherine. I'm asking if we can honor her memory by building a future she would have wanted for us. A future with someone who loves these children as much as she did. Someone who makes this house feel like a home again. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Daniel, are you sure? We said we'd wait. I've waited long enough. Grief doesn't have a timeline, and I'll carry Catherine in my heart forever. But I'm ready to live again. I'm ready to love again. If you'll have me. If you'll have all of us. The children were watching her with expressions ranging from hope to uncertainty to cautious joy. Eleanor looked at each of them in turn. Rebecca, who'd fought so hard to protect her mother's memory, but was now nodding with quiet approval. Thomas, whose face was breaking into a wide smile. Sarah, who was gripping Caleb's hand tightly, her fierce little face showing vulnerability for once. Caleb, whose hands moved in careful signs. Stay. Please stay. And Mary, who reached up to pat Eleanor's face with sticky baby hands, babbling nonsense that sounded like agreement. Yes, Eleanor said, the word coming out choked with emotion. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll be mother to these children. I'll stay for as long as you'll have me. The room erupted. Thomas whooped with joy. Sarah started crying and laughing simultaneously. Caleb's hands flew in excited patterns. Rebecca stood and crossed to Eleanor, wrapping her arms around her in a fierce embrace. Thank you, Rebecca whispered. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for loving Papa. Thank you for not trying to replace Mama, but still being willing to be our mother anyway. Eleanor held the girl close, This fierce, brave, wounded child who'd been holding her world together for so long. "Thank you for letting me," she whispered back. Daniel pulled them both into his arms, and then the other children piled on, and suddenly they were all embracing in a tangle of arms and laughter and tears. Mary, caught in the middle, giggled with delight at all the attention. It wasn't a perfect moment. Perfect would have meant Catherine was still alive, that these children hadn't lost their mother, that grief wasn't still a presence in this house. But it was real and honest and full of hope for a future that honored the past while embracing what could be. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Eleanor and Daniel sat together on the porch. Spring air carried the scent of thawing earth and distant rain. The world felt full of possibility. "I should probably court you properly," Daniel said. "Take you to dinner in town, bring you flowers, do things the right way." Eleanor smiled. "I think we've done most things backwards already. Why start following convention now?" "Because you deserve romance. You deserve to be wooed and treasured and made to feel special. I feel special every day. You don't need grand gestures to make me feel valued." Daniel took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Tell me about your parents." "You never talk about them." The question surprised Eleanor, but she found she wanted to answer. "They died when I was 8. Cholera outbreak. My father was a carpenter, like I told Thomas. My mother was a seamstress. They loved each other so much it was almost embarrassing to watch as a child, always holding hands, always finding excuses to be near each other. I used to roll my eyes at their constant affection. You must miss them. Every day, but especially now when I'm about to start a family of my own. I wish they could see this. Wish they could meet you and the children. My mother would have loved Rebecca's fierce spirit. My father would have appreciated how hard you work to provide for your family. They'd be proud of you, of the woman you've become." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I hope so. I hope they'd understand why I'm choosing this life. Why I'm choosing you." "Why are you?" Daniel asked quietly. "Choosing me, I mean. You could have left today, could have gone to Denver with your aunt, started fresh somewhere else. Why stay in this frozen corner of Wyoming with a widower and 5 children who aren't yours?" Eleanor turned to face him fully, needing him to see the truth in her eyes. "Because somewhere between collecting eggs and learning sign language and bathing a feverish baby at 3 in the morning, I fell in love. Not just with you, though that happened too, but with Rebecca's strength and Thomas's gentle heart and Sarah's fire and Caleb's quiet wisdom and Mary's innocent joy. I fell in love with this broken, beautiful family and the way you're all trying so hard to survive and thrive despite losing so much." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My aunt was right about one thing. You needed a housekeeper, and I needed employment. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. You started needing me, not because I could cook and clean, but because I understood. Because I saw your grief and didn't try to rush you past it. Because I loved your children without expecting them to love me back. And I needed you, all of you, because you gave me something I'd never had before. A place where my worth wasn't tied to my usefulness, where I was valued just for being me." Daniel's eyes were bright with emotion. "Catherine left those notes for you. I'm sure of it now. She knew she was dying, and she wanted to make sure whoever came after her would have everything they needed to love this family properly. But I don't think even she imagined someone like you. Someone who'd read those notes and used them not to replace her, but to honor her. Someone who'd love us enough to stay, even when given the chance to leave. I'm not trying to be Catherine. I know. You're Eleanor, and that's exactly who we need." He leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and tentative, as if they were both fragile things that might break. It was nothing like the passionate kisses Eleanor had read about in novels. It was gentle and careful and tasted of tears and hope. It was a promise and a question and an answer all at once. When they pulled apart, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I do love you. I need you to know that. It's different from how I loved Catherine, but it's real and it's deep and it's growing stronger every day. I love you too, and I love what we're building here, a family that honors the past while creating something new." They sat together under the stars, hands clasped, 2 people who'd found each other through grief and necessity and had somehow created something beautiful from the broken pieces. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, in early April, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and the last patches of snow finally melted away. They married in the house, surrounded by the children and a few neighbors, including Mrs. Patterson, who proclaimed it about time and wiped away tears throughout the brief ceremony. Eleanor wore a simple dress that Rebecca and Sarah had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair that Caleb had picked that morning. Daniel wore his best suit, looking nervous and happy, and more relaxed than Eleanor had seen him since they met. The children stood with them, integral parts of the ceremony rather than witnesses. When the minister asked who gave Eleanor to this family, Rebecca stepped forward with quiet pride and said, "We all do. We choose her, and she chooses us." There was no way to get through those words without crying. After the ceremony, they celebrated with a feast that the whole community had contributed to. Tables appeared laden with food, and the house filled with music and laughter and the kind of joy that comes from witnessing new beginnings. Rebecca pulled Eleanor aside at one point, her young face serious. "I found something I want to give you." She produced a small wooden box that Eleanor recognized from Catherine's things. Inside was a delicate gold ring, simple and elegant. "Mama's wedding ring," Rebecca said. "Papa gave her a new one on their 10th anniversary, something fancier. But this was her first ring, the one he gave her when they married. I think she'd want you to have it." Eleanor's hands shook as she lifted the ring from the box. "Rebecca, I can't. This is yours, a keepsake from your mother." "I have lots of keepsakes. Her hairbrush, her favorite shawl, her recipes, her notes. But this is meant to be worn by someone Papa loves. Someone who loves us back. That's you now." Eleanor slipped the ring onto her finger where it settled as if it had been made for her. "Thank you. I'll treasure it always." "I know you will." Rebecca hugged her tightly. "Thank you for not trying to erase her, for letting us keep her memory while still giving us a future. She'll always be part of this family. I'll make sure of it." That night, after the guests had left and the children were in bed, Eleanor and Daniel stood together in the room that was now theirs. Catherine's things had been carefully moved to the attic, not discarded but respectfully set aside. The room felt different now, still honoring the past but open to the future. "No regrets?" Daniel asked. "None. You?" "Not a single one." He pulled her close and Eleanor felt the rightness of it. This was where she belonged. This was home. The months that followed brought their own challenges. Learning to be a wife as well as a mother, navigating the complicated emotions that came with loving a man who'd loved someone else first, dealing with the inevitable whispers from townspeople who thought she was moving too fast, replacing Catherine too easily. But Eleanor had the children on her side, and that made everything bearable. When gossip reached her ears, Sarah would march up to the gossipers and inform them loudly that Eleanor was the best mother anyone could ask for, and they should mind their own business. When Eleanor doubted herself, Rebecca would remind her of all the ways she'd improved their lives. When she felt overwhelmed, Thomas would bring her flowers picked from the fields. Caleb would sign words of comfort. Mary would reach for her with complete trust. And Daniel was steady and present, and increasingly comfortable showing affection. The careful distance he'd maintained at first gradually dissolved. He'd reach for her hand while walking, pull her close while washing dishes, kiss her goodbye when he left for town. Small gestures that meant everything. By summer, Eleanor was pregnant. The news brought joy and trepidation in equal measure. She'd be bringing a new life into this blended family, and she worried about how the children would respond. She needn't have worried. "A baby!" Sarah shrieked with delight. "Can we name it after Mama if it's a girl?" Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. "Would you like that?" "Yes, so part of Mama can be here with us again." They gathered as a family to discuss it, and everyone agreed. If the baby was a girl, they'd name her Catherine Rose. If a boy, James, after Daniel's father. Catherine Rose Hayes was born the following February, almost exactly a year after Eleanor's arrival at the ranch. She came into the world with a full head of dark hair and her father's brown eyes, screaming her displeasure at the cold and the light and everything that wasn't the warm safety of the womb. Eleanor held her daughter and wept with joy and grief and gratitude. This baby girl would know her mother, would grow up loved and wanted and safe. would have siblings who adored her, and a father who treasured her, and a life full of possibility. And somewhere, Eleanor liked to think, the first Catherine Hayes was smiling. Her family had survived. Her children had found someone to love them. Her husband had found happiness again. And her memory lived on, not in grief and loss, but in the love that had rebuilt this family from the ashes of tragedy. Years later, when people asked Eleanor about her life, she would think back to that auction where she'd been sold for $40, to the moment her worth had been measured and found so terribly wanting, to the fear and shame and desperate hope that had carried her through those first days at the ranch. She'd been bought like property, sent to work for strangers in a frozen wilderness, expected to fulfill a contract and nothing more. Instead, she'd found a home, a family, a love so deep and true it had healed wounds she didn't know she carried. She'd arrived believing she was worthless, worth only what someone would pay for her labor. She left that belief behind in the snow and the grief and the slow, careful building of trust. Now she knew better. She knew that worth wasn't measured in dollars or usefulness or what others decided you deserved. Worth was measured in the children who called her mama, in the husband who chose her every single day, in the life they'd built together from broken pieces and hope and a dead woman's notes that had guided a stranger toward love. Eleanor Whitfield Hayes stood on the porch of her home one spring morning, watching her children play in the yard. Rebecca, now a young woman, teaching the younger ones to ride. Thomas reading under a tree, no longer embarrassed by his struggles but proud of how far he'd come. Sarah arguing passionately with her father about something while he listened with amused patience. Caleb signing stories to little Catherine Rose, who watched with rapt attention. Mary toddling after them all, determined to keep up despite her short legs. And Daniel beside her, his hand finding hers automatically, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Happy?" he asked. Eleanor looked at the life spread before her, messy and imperfect and more beautiful than anything she dared to dream. "More than I ever thought possible." "I love you," Daniel said, and the words still made her heart race even though she'd heard them hundreds of times now. "I love you too. All of you." The girl who'd been worth $40 had found something priceless. She'd found belonging, purpose, a family who'd needed her, yes, but more importantly, who'd wanted her, who'd chosen her, who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. She'd come to this ranch believing it was temporary, a year of service and then freedom. Instead, she'd found the kind of freedom that only comes from choosing to stay, from loving so completely that leaving became unthinkable, from building a life so rich and full that the past pain became just one thread in a larger, more beautiful tapestry. The wind carried the sound of children's laughter across the prairie. Spring flowers bloomed in wild profusion, and Eleanor Hayes smiled, her husband's hand warm in hers, and knew with complete certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Home. Finally, truly, home.